Hello, I'm William Paceley, and today I'm here with Michael Christie, who is conducting the Rochester Philharmonic Orchestra this week. This series is one of many interviews that we've done with guest conductors of the RPO this season. Michael, it's great to have you here.
Thank you. It's great to be back in Western New York.
It's a pleasure to have you. I heard you're from Buffalo.
I am indeed.
Oh, okay. Perfect.
Duff's or Anchor Bar, you know. That's
Great. Well, let's jump right into it. Let's talk about Marymount. I know that that's what you're working on right now,
Right.
and it's going to be brought to Carnegie Hall.
Yeah.
So how's that process been for you? What's it been like working with the RPO? And just really, most importantly, you know, this is the home of Howard Hanson.
Yeah.
So how's it been working in such a prestigious place?
Yeah, it's amazing. Actually, I got a tour of the Sibley Library, the vault where all the manuscripts and things are kept. So I saw the 3 volumes of the bound original score, and actually I'm working on a photocopy of that. So it's nice actually to have been working with Howard Hanson's print at actual handwritten music the whole way. Although sometimes I have to admit I've had a bit of a magnifying glass. Some of the words get pretty small. There's a lot going on. The whole Philharmonic organization's been awesome. Obviously, going towards Carnegie, aiming toward that arrival has been an enormously galvanizing effort for the whole organization. So the collaboration with Eastman's also fantastic. Dr. William Weichert, that's been fantastic. And you know, it's certainly when you have that end goal in sight. It's very exciting. Also gives you a lot of things to think about to make sure that things are refined.
Sure.
But by doing these previews, we really get a chance to test out the decisions we've made about the piece and see, and if there are adjustments to be made, we have a couple of weeks to make those adjustments. But yeah, from my standpoint, it's just been the arrival of the score about a year ago, and then making decisions about who's going to sing,
Sure.
Which music, what we're going to leave in, what we're potentially going to take out of the piece, because there are some extraneous storylines, I have to admit, I maybe snipped away a little bit.
Sure. Well, you know, I know you have your foot in 2 doors. You were with the Phoenix Symphony for a long time, and now you're recently appointed in the Minnesota Opera.
Yeah.
And do you find it hard to balance those 2 worlds of going from symphony to opera, or are they kind of a seamless environment for you?
Well, they're different in a lot of ways. Obviously, the complexity of the different programs or the different offerings are very different. With the symphony orchestra, the conductor tends to be a little bit more in charge, to the extent that you have these 2 days typically to put the program together, and so you're really trying to corral the forces very quickly to give whatever that spontaneity and that kind of informed concept of the performance.
Yes.
With opera, you've got 5 weeks, and you know, it's a different thing because you're not the only one that's driving the vision of a performance. You have a stage director, you have a lighting director, you've got all the people that are up on stage performing from memory with light shining in their eyes, and the costume and the makeup and the whole rigmarole. So it's very different. But the good thing is that they both inform each other. Obviously, I think coming from a symphonic background most recently, I think I have a little bit more of a sense of like maybe more of a vision of how it's going to look in the end, because that's the way I had been thinking for well over a decade.
Sure.
Got these couple of days, how do I want it to actually be? And then on the symphonic side, I can come to an orchestra maybe with a bit more of a sense of a lyricism, maybe a little bit of a different idea of a certain composer's drama, which they would have infused into an opera. Mozart's a perfect example. Certainly anything that's Italian, you get a sense of what the prevailing concept of musicality and emotional expression is. And then you can't help but think, well, if a composer put that into their opera, they probably would have thought the same about a piano concerto.
Yeah.
Or not, or some just kind of somewhere in the same vein, because it's in their DNA.
Sure. Would you say it's more collaborative to work on an opera? Do you feel you have more artistic direction with a symphony, or is an opera really less in your hands and in your mind?
Well, I think in both cases you're really trying to facilitate the performer's ability to do the best they can.
Sure.
It just takes on such a different a different view, and the scope of the projects are so different.
Yeah.
Because often the length of an entire symphony program will be one act of an opera.
Sure.
And so you're just setting a different horizon of pacing. Exactly. Yeah. So it's kind of fun actually when you do a symphony concert and you get out in 2 hours and you think, boy, that would be intermission.
Yeah. Yeah. You mentioned earlier in the interview that you received the score to Marymount a year ago.
Right.
Is that the typical length in which you score study and prepare for a performance?
I try to get the music as early as possible. We're very fortunate with Marymount because that has been in existence since the 30s, so that was easily available. But I've received many a world premiere 3 weeks beforehand, something like that. And so the biggest thing I have to do in looking out at my calendar of works is to try to figure out, okay, if that composer of a new piece is late, how can I backload all of my study so that I will have time in case something gets
to prepare.
Yeah. But that's you figure that out after 20 years.
Experience. Yeah, that's a perfect segue to my next point. Michael, you're so young. You're 39, if I'm correct.
Yep.
And I know that you have conducted some of the biggest and best orchestras in the world. As a young musician myself, I'm curious, what do you attribute your great success to?
Well, when I got started conducting professionally, there was a huge surge of young conductors. And many of them are very successful today. Some have disappeared. But there was this time in the 90s where orchestras were saying, okay, there's this talent that seems to be bubbling up of people who can bring something fairly matured to the symphonic and operatic world. And so there was a lot of interest. And so I think I was kind of in that first wave of people. And then, I don't know, then just like with any career, you kind of make decisions and things kind of go the kind of interest goes up and down. I made a very big decision pretty early on that I wanted to really be involved in the American music director scene. And so that really changed my career trajectory from being quite European-based, a lot of guest conducting, going to chamber orchestras, huge orchestras, all sorts of things. And it really brought my focus to the United States. And that has its own career implications. Now I'm going back more to Europe just because it's nice to experience a different working environment, different thinking about music. But I'm so really desperately interested to see how American conductors can have a lasting impact on the American music scene.
Absolutely, and that brings up a great point. For American orchestras, since now you're grounded in this world, it's a pretty turbulent time as of recently.
Yeah.
As you know, San Diego Opera folded and then didn't, and
right,
and who even knows at this point? And
right.
Even in Minnesota, the Minnesota Symphony has been having its own problems. What do you see as the most important things to focus on for the success of American orchestras?
Wow.
In the future?
My view is that we have to be much more focused on the experience that people have. And that's not just whether we play Mozart or Brahms or a new work. But there is an expectation that people have that from the moment that they think, I'm going to go hear the Rochester Philharmonic, they get on their smartphones and then they go to the website to see what's on. There needs to be a doorway there about what the experience is going to be like. Then they get to the hall. Before they get to their seat, what's the experience going to be like? When the concert's actually happening, what's the experience? And then the after. And I think a lot of other, certainly rock venues, bigger arenas, they seem to have that a little bit better handle on getting people tuned into what's actually going to happen. And so there's more of an expectation. I think the American classical music opera still suffers a bit from people not quite knowing what it's going to be.
Okay.
And so I think we need to communicate that a lot better with our audience. And I think in some ways American orchestras get a little stuck in kind of staring at each other and saying, well, how can we be as good as XYZ orchestra?
Sure.
And I really feel like the focus really needs to be right back on the hometown of that orchestra. And I think if there's any notoriety to come from what an orchestra is doing, it's because of the success that they're having in their local community. And there's no easy example of one doing better than another. Cleveland Orchestra, it happens to be doing some very interesting things with kind of adopting a neighborhood in a certain week, and they plunge into this neighborhood and do all these kinds of projects. Maybe that's a great solution. Sure. Los Angeles Philharmonic's very lucky to have the Hollywood Bowl, because that brings them into a year-round, very diverse musical experience with their public. But then a lot of vibrancy is happening in really small orchestras, and they're engaging in their communities very meaningful ways. So it really depends. But ultimately, I think it's going to be the experience, setting people up, really getting them to understand what it's going to be, creating very dynamic experiences within the concert hall itself, and then doing it for your people rather than kind of navel gazing and thinking, oh, well, will we ever be as good as Chicago? Does it matter?
Yeah. Well, I did a bit of snooping, I'll admit, and I looked on your Facebook page and I saw that you were praising a certain orchestra and opera company for live streaming.
Yeah.
And you mentioned how Cleveland kind of has adopted neighborhood, and Detroit Symphony has been doing the webcasts at full force recently.
Yep.
And these are both great examples of orchestras breaking out of their one region, just their local region.
Right.
Do you think that is going to play a part in the future of orchestras, and how do you think we can get there to leverage technology to our advantage to help us?
Well, I definitely think that by and large, American orchestras have not yet figured out how technology can be useful for them. So obviously Detroit has zeroed in on their performances. How many people from outside of Detroit watch those performances? I don't know that information.
It's a pretty large number.
But the access that is granted to whomever through the internet is just awesome. And I think
I agree.
That's really where, that's really where a lot of opportunity rests, because then you can actually convey the message of what you're doing in your community to that community who either doesn't want to drive late at night, sure, whatever reasons that they don't want to, that they can't necessarily access you in your downtown venue. And I think that's actually, I applaud the Vienna State Opera for making their live stream of Lohengrin available, because yes, of course, the Met is sending out the signal to movie theaters, but that's still saying to everybody, you must go
physically to a location
in order to experience us.
Yes.
And it's great. I mean, it's fantastic. And the entry price, $22 or whatever it is
it's a steal.
You can't beat it. But it doesn't quite answer the question of where the internet and where these phones and people experiencing electronic life in their home and what that means for their consumption of the arts, what that means. We're not giving them the opportunity to make that decision unless we put it out there and just see what happens. So I'm very hopeful that people are going to get over a couple of points. You are not going to earn money on the internet. That is the biggest thing. I don't know how we're going to get people convinced about that, but you can't monetize it at this point. Maybe somewhere down the road, Verizon and Comcast and all those groups will figure out some way to monetize that doesn't just go to their shareholders, and then just figuring out a way that we can produce good production value for something that's not going to break the bank and still be good enough that people will say, you know what, I'm going to click on the Rochester Philharmonic live feed rather than the Detroit Symphony live feed, because it's, whatever those production values are still strong enough that I'm compelled to stay with my hometown team in my marketplace. And I think when you start doing that, it's good. It doesn't have to be as good as the Berlin Philharmonic Digital Concert Hall, but there are certain things that I think we can present that are just as striking to people and gets the feeling to the extent you can, not being there. But I to any group that's going to do it, I say go for it and just give it a try, because there's only gain in it. I really think there's only gain.
I agree with you. Let's move on to how at Phoenix. Let's talk about at Phoenix how you drew in audiences. I read a little bit about, I believe it was called Intermission Insights.
Right. Yeah.
How about talk about that for a second and how you're drawing in new audiences and keeping them there?
Well, yeah. Actually, we really, Phoenix is a really interesting example, because the audience there is really two segments. You have a fixed income group that wasn't it was impacted by the recession in a very different way. They didn't actually get a drop in their income because they're on Medicaid and Social Security. So actually our ticket numbers were quite stable because people had allocated a certain portion of their income
to go to the symphony.
To go to the symphony, and that was, food prices didn't go up, gas prices by and large didn't go crazy. Sometimes they spiked, but and then there's another group of donors, and that was where the big hit happened because that everybody's portfolios were just completely sunk. So that was a very interesting thing because we weren't desperate for subscribers in a way. Like we didn't see like this massive drop off of people. So that was good. But I'll relate one story that I was working for the now defunct Florida Philharmonic.
Okay.
And we're at a concert in West Palm Beach, and we did performance Dvorak's Sixth Symphony. The general manager said, hey, we always do these post-concert chats and people can ask questions. So I go back out after the concert and there's like 8 people there. And so we're driving back to the hotel afterward and I said, hey, 8 people, what is that? Is that
normal?
Normal? Yeah, he's like, oh yeah, people are, I forgot to mention it, but yeah, of course people are racing out to the parking lot to get to their car. And so I said, well, why don't you do these while they're here, like at the intermission? And he said, no way, because the artists want to be in their world and preparing for the second half. And my personal response to that is, if you're not ready for the second half, by the time the concert comes, you're toast anyway. But not everybody feels that way, and I give them perfect. It's no condemnation if that's not how you feel. But for me personally, I said to Phoenix, I said to my music festival in Boulder, what would happen if we gave people an opportunity to interface with the guest artists as soon as they're done playing the concerto? Not required. The orchestra goes off stage. The intermission actually happens. But let's set a 10-minute window right at the beginning of intermission that anybody who wants to stay can come and ask questions and all that stuff. And the response was, yeah, sure, fine, but no one's going to stick around. Well, they could not have been more wrong. Most nights we had over 2/3 of the audience stay in their seats for 10 minutes, asking questions, and they're really interesting questions about people really paying attention to, well, if you're playing Prokofiev Violin Concerto this week and then next week you're playing Mozart somewhere else, like how do you deal with that, like mentally and physically, and how do you deal with life on the road when you're going over the ocean? And it was a really interesting question. What were you thinking? Do you think about anything during the performance of a concerto besides just whether you're playing the right notes? And then you start getting into this narrative thing. How do you memorize? And I thought, man, that is really cool. So for my whole tenure in Phoenix, we did that, and it was just awesome. And people got a great connection to the artists. And so I think my idea was that if we can create little add-ons to the experience that people can opt in or opt out, then we have more opportunity to grab people where they want to be in a performance. Because you have to remember that we put on a concert of a Mozart piano concerto. That's the only thing people are experiencing at that moment. But in a hall of 2,000 seats, there are 2,000 different expectations about what that should be like. So if we can even create 2 or 3 more options and opportunities for how people experience that Mozart piano concerto, it's double or triple what they would have had without it. Yeah. And so I always just say, like, what is another doorway we can give somebody? Because maybe 10 people go through that door, maybe 100 people go through that door, maybe 1,000 people go through that door. Intermission Insights, we had a lot of people go through that door. I also would do, so to introduce a concert, I would usually come out, say good evening, maybe if there's something important about the program. But we consciously decided to not have the orchestra on the stage at that point because we wanted, again, to make the experience be able to be, in a certain way, kind of customizable for somebody. So if someone's like, I don't want to hear the conductor talk, then they could read their program notes, they could do whatever, but it wouldn't interfere with the experience of the pure orchestral arrival on the stage. And I always found that it was kind of confusing for the audience. The orchestra's sitting there ready to go. They're tuned up, and then what happens? Then the conductor comes out and you're talking. And that's good, but for the people who don't want that and just would rather have the conductor comes out, the orchestra plays, we clap, and we go home, how can we create that still kind of still encapsulate that experience? So that's been kind of my thinking. Like, try to think about it from the audience's perspective. What are they actually experiencing? Are there ways that they can get a little bit more information if they want it, and not ram it down their throat? And then but still be mindful of the fact that there are a lot of people that have come to hear a Brahms symphony in its entirety, in silence, and then go home. So that's what's been on my mind.
Amazing project. Well, Michael, it's been a pleasure having you here, and thanks so much. I'm very excited to see what you can transform in the classical music world in the coming years.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Pleasure.